Sorry, I'll do that again because recording aside. Thank you. Thank you, Tasha. Welcome everyone to today's CQ and Leadership webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're dialing in from, as it looks like we have people dialing in pretty much from all over the world, which is amazing. So I'm Ritika, excited to be here as the Director of UK Operations for the Cultural Intelligence Centre, and really their first employee of the first subsidiary of the Cultural Intelligence Centre, but quickly looking to lead a bigger team. I oversee everything for our UK operations, right from development to delivery and everything else in between. So leadership styles and the topic of leadership is always important, but even more so in the current context. And as we dive into the details of this webinar, I really wanted to kick off by wanting to take a moment to acknowledge all that is going on around us. The pandemic, the war, racial discrimination in the face of war. I appreciate it is a lot to take in, and we are grateful for your presence on this webinar. Before we go into the introductions and content, I would like to just go through some of the logistics and basics, really. You're automatically muted and cameras are off. Please feel free to add any comments to the chat and send us your questions via the Q&A tab, and we will try to answer as many as possible. If we cannot answer them now, we'll try to email a response. For those of you who want to come back and watch this webinar again, or even feel that you might want to share it, it is being recorded and will be available on our website, and will also be emailed to all those that have registered. Right, with that done, I am truly excited about the panel on this webinar today. I have been so lucky to have worked closely with the three culturally intelligent leaders on this webinar. And really, I can see their faces and they couldn't be more different from each other, which is the most exciting part, really. Yet the common thread among the three of them is their passion for what they do and all that they stand for. It is obvious in their work and comes through in the authentic leadership style that I'm personally a huge fan of. So we have, to kick off with, we have Dave Livermore. Dave co-founded the Cultural Intelligence Center with Lynn Van Dyne and served as the president for the first 11 years. He continues to serve as a strategic advisor and board member. Dave has written over a dozen books on cultural intelligence and global leadership, and has worked with companies, governments, and nonprofits in more than 100 countries. With that, I would like to then introduce Shahana Ramsden. Shahana has a 35-year career in the public sector in health and social care. She's currently employed as Director of Vaccination Workforce in the Southeast region and Special Advisor on Vaccine Equalities. Shahana also co-chairs the NHS England and NHS Improvement Southeast Turning the Tide Transformational and Oversight Board, which was established during the COVID-19 pandemic to accelerate the region's response to addressing racial inequalities across workforce and communities. Shahana has spent her life and career working tirelessly to ensure that the voices of underrepresented groups are heard. Right, this is, I'm just so honored to have. And then there's Rob, I would love to introduce Rob Neal as our third panelist. Rob has spent much of his illustrious career working in the Ministry of Justice. Over almost 40 years in the civil service, he has made a huge impact in HR, race equality, employee engagement, and diversity and inclusion. He was a founding member of the Ministry of Justice BAME staff network in 2001. He ended his tenure as the chair of Civil Service Race Equality Network. After a total of 38 years with the civil service, Rob departed the public sector to launch his own consultancy to support organizations across all sectors and to be more inclusive. Sectors for organizations to be more inclusive, sorry. In October 2021, Rob was included in HR Magazine's list of 50 most influential thinkers. Last but not the least, Rob also has been awarded an OBE by the Queen for his work on race equality. So, without further ado, and that now we know we have an illustrious panel on board, what are we going to cover in the next hour or so? Dave will kick off with a clear link between CQ and leadership. We will also have some very pertinent questions around this topic to ask Shahana and Rob, and then we open the floor up to your questions. Without further ado, Dave, the stage is all yours.
Thank you so much, Ritika. And let me add my greeting and welcome to all of you joining us from a variety of places around the world. I just want to build on what Ritika said and frame our conversation for the next hour by sharing three things with you that emerge from our experience at the Cultural Intelligence Center, as well as what the research tells us. And the first one is this. There's no question that leadership is the key driver in terms of whether or not cultural intelligence actually becomes part of the DNA of an organization. And we've worked with extremely flat, low power distance organizations in the tech sector or in Scandinavian cultures. And of course, we've also worked with very high power distance finance companies or the various government entities. Regardless of how top down or flat they are, the leadership is absolutely key to what happens. And we have such a timely moment of this, don't we? At the risk of exploiting the tragedy that's going on between Russia and Ukraine, you look at Zelensky and the leadership moment that we see in him and the clear difference that it seems to be making in what's playing out without knowing how that's all going to happen. So the first one is rather obvious, but it's an important point to note that leadership is absolutely critical, and we see that again and again, even though oftentimes we get started working with an organization and we don't necessarily get the top leadership to buy in. It might start with the Diversity Council. It might start with a group that's more focused on international mobility or cross-border teams, but ultimately to have a culturally intelligent organization that drives transformation and change has to be started at the top. The second one is, I think it's really critical for us to talk about the link that is inextricably tying leadership and culture together. That is to say that our own cultural narrative strongly shapes who we lead, how we lead, and whether or not we respect those in leadership over us. So keep that in mind, because some of the questions that Ritika and I want to tease out with Shahana and Rob get at this notion of how does our own cultural background interface with the cultural backgrounds of those that we lead, and how does that all play itself together with transformation and cultural intelligence. Third point that I want to say by way of introduction is we know both from watching a number of organizations over the last 11 years and through 20 years of research that cultural intelligence in leadership is directly tied to all kinds of outcomes. And that is to say that we know that a culturally intelligent leader leads to innovation, leads to trust building, leads to more effective negotiation, leads to employee engagement, on and on the list goes. So this is more than just kind of a rah-rah around cultural intelligence. We know that leadership and CQ are these interesting pieces that fit together that then lead to transformation, organizational change, and all the great things we want to talk about. So I just wanted to share that as a little bit of a context. If this and the ensuing conversation intrigues you, you're getting just a teaser of what we're going to be talking about in some of the upcoming events that I'm privileged to be part of in London. I know Ritika will say a little bit more about that later on, but we have a whole morning devoted to the topic of leadership, transformation, and cultural intelligence coming up. So with that in mind, Ritika, let me turn it over to you to ask our first question.
Thank you, Dave. That was very helpful. Sorry, can you hear the echo? Is that gone? Sorry, that was very helpful introduction. And yeah, launching straight into the question. Shahana, my first question is for you. How do you balance the attention of being authentic while also adapting to the diversity of preferences of those you lead?
Yes, this is something I have thought about because I've been through the cultural intelligence assessment myself, and CQ gave us a language and a vocabulary as a team to think about when we're in a room together, what's happening, what's impacting on those interactions as a team. Individually, as a leader, CQ has helped me to really think, to look in the mirror and get an understanding of who I am and what impact my leadership style my cultural values have on others. Now, like many people in the room, I'm sure I've used tools such as the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs, and I've used the Aston Teen Development Assessment. So lots of tools around what helps us to create a high-performing team. But what I always felt was missing, there was a disconnect between these tools and the person that I am, because they didn't take into account our cultural values. So I have an interesting experience of it in my team. I got them all trained in CQ, and we completed our self-assessments and put a big chart on the wall and looked at where people were on different parts of the dimensions. Now, interesting that one of our team members had a completely different profile to everyone else. She was low power, distance, low uncertainty avoidance, so she was good at sort of uncertainty, and she was very direct in her communications. And in our team, we were able to have an honest conversation about the fact that we have these cultural differences, and that it did impact on the way we work together. And as a result, we did take that into account. Instead of being irritated by the direct communication, it was in understanding. So we moved away from misunderstanding to being in a place where there was no blame and judgment. So for us, we found it very powerful.
Thank you, Shahana. I would like to add there really that I do this for a living, right? I try to convince the world that CQ is everything. And that first conversation I had with you, Shahana, as a client, because you'd gone through the certified facilitator program and rolled it out within the vaccinations program, I cried when you told me the effect that it has had on you personally and professionally. I was like, oh my God, I'm right to be on this path, for this to be my purpose, to bring it to the world. Because when I hear people like you in positions of leadership that have the power to influence, genuinely believe in CQ because you feel that it can make a difference, then that's my job done, really. So thank you. Rob, same question to you, my friend.
Oh, well, thank you, Catch. And thank you to everyone on the call. Thank you for inviting my contribution to this wonderful debate. I think one of the biggest challenges I've got is managing my excitement, because whenever there is a conversation that is focused on cultural intelligence, whether you've come at that from the academic route or you've just come about it instinctively and anecdotally, I get excited. I get excited because somewhere between those two is the wonderful world in which I guess we all live. Dave has already alluded to it, and we shouldn't overstate it, but nor should we forget it. You know, right now there's another war that's going on in the world, nearly 500 already having lost their life. And whatever we want to say about the respective leaders involved in that, one can say that, you know, without certain actions taken by certainly the Russian leader, those lives would not have been lost. We've got to think about that, really. In answer to your question, Ritika, I think, how do I balance the tension? Well, I do it often instinctively. I do it bravely because there are some real tough decisions in all of that. I do it on purpose and with a purpose. Whenever I'm part of a team, responsible for leading the team throughout the time in my civil service career, but I do it with attention. I do it with a real curiosity. I do it with a real optimism. I truly believe, have always believed, even before I bumped into some of the technical narrative behind cultural intelligence, I've always believed that the best answer lays in bringing people together, giving each other a good listening to, and responding to what we hear. And I've long since learnt that there is a difference between listening and hearing. Some people conflate those two and they end up convincing themselves that the same thing. They're not really. It is about us listening and hearing what's being said. And so with a real curiosity that at times feels insatiable for me, I like to get up close and work personally. And those that have worked either alongside me or part of my team will hopefully testify to that. Some of them are on this call now. And it's with that really that I look to balance any tension, not forgetting the wonderful synergy that comes out of those moments. Because sometimes, you know, this, we offer this dichotomy, don't we, that how do you balance the tension sounds like it's hard work all the time. And I'm sure my friend Shahana and Dave will agree that it's not always hard work. Sometimes you hit that flow and you know you're doing the right thing and it just feels right. You know, I'm reminded of what Maya Angelou says, you know, I'll forget what you did, I'll forget what you said, but I'll never forget the way you made me feel. And you said it yourself, Ritika. You remembered that moment with Shahana because it moved you emotionally and you remember how you felt. And I think that's one of the beautiful things, one of the beautiful rewards about a journey in cultural intelligence, because what it does is that it encourages us, each of us, all of us, to really connect with our feelings about these given situations and challenges and really understand what it is that we're here to do. So that's what I do, instinctively, bravely, on purpose, with a purpose. And I do it with a real curiosity about the optimistic outcome that's always possible and within reach.
So good. Thank you to both of you. And there's so much there for us to unpack further, and maybe we'll have a chance to do that even as we open up the Q&A to everyone. I just want to make brief reference to a comment that Jade, one of our certified facilitators in the US, has raised that pulls off of the input that you all had. And Jade, I'm going to put it off a little bit because we're going to actually come back to this a little bit later on in some of the questions. But the very rich one that Jade is asking that in part inspired the question that Ritika just asked, and that is, where's the fine line between being true to yourself as a leader and then having to adapt to others? And as Jade noted, where does covering factor into that? How do we bring our whole selves to work, but also not force everyone to be like us? So for now, I'm just going to kind of put that out there and note that it was raised because I know Ritika and I may have some things to say about that in a little bit as well. I want to follow up on another question here with Shahana and Rob. So both of you, and Ritika included, are obviously visibly different than I am. And you're often asked to lead in context where the makeup of complexion that we see among the four of us is not typical, but rather I'm the norm that you're then going into an environment and having to lead. So I want to lean into that maybe uncomfortable conversation for a little bit and start with you, Shahana, and say, okay, so the NHS is a very diverse place. I've had a little bit of opportunity to encounter the breadth of diversity that's there, but the higher you go up in leadership, the more leadership looks like me. So talk a little bit what it's like to, as a woman of color, lead in a context where many of the other leaders don't very much look like you or have a background like you.
Thank you. Yeah, and every single time I go into a room where I'm not known, I ask myself that question about what do people see first? Do they see my ethnicity? Do they see my gender? Or do they just see me as one of their colleagues and leader? And that's a question that I've explored through my CQ assessment journey, because I want to know what impact does it have if they see me first as a woman or first as if they other me as soon as I walk in the room, what impact does that have on the interaction that they have with me? Now, in my early career, the way I experienced this, as somebody who's really ambitious and wanted to get to a more senior position, it was that the advice I was given is that whether subtle or unsubtle, is that I have to be more like everyone else to be able to survive in this world of leadership. So I needed to be more authoritative, more assertive. I need to get a firmer handshake. So they were the messages I was getting. And I was looking around me and there was no one like me. And I thought, you can't be what you can't see, which is what drove me to keep applying for those promotions and to get to a senior role. But the impact that had on me personally was that it made me feel that the person I am isn't good enough. I felt that what I had to offer didn't meet the mark. I felt that there was something missing. And at one point in my career, when I hit what I would say is a glass ceiling or a concrete ceiling, I came to this, I almost thought, I have such a lovely life and a lovely family, and I just wonder whether I've reached my limitations and I need to give up. So I did have that poignant moment when I thought I can't get any further. But then something that cultural intelligence has really done for me, there were loads of light bulb moments when I first came across the CQ assessment. Because for me, it took away that blame and it took away that judgment about one style is better than the other. Because I am, in my communication, I am more indirect, I am more collectivist, I am cooperative. But I was working with perhaps a majority group who are more direct and individualistic. And that has really helped me to take that blame away from myself. And Jade was talking about, learning to be true to yourself. And I think that's what happened for me, was I learned that leading with humility is not something to apologize for, it's a strength. And I've been able to step in comfortably to acknowledging my style of leadership and not feeling othered by it.
So rich. Thank you, Shahana. I think we lost just a moment there. Maybe the internet cut out, but really rich reflections on how you've held that tension, to use Rob's word, that doesn't have to be negative, of what it means to adapt to the environment, but to not somehow lose yourself in the process. How about you, Rob, as a person of color in the government?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been a journey, I can tell you that. And certainly, as a son of Jamaican parents, growing up in the north of London, north of the river, I'm appreciative that there are people from around the world on this, but really walking into any workplace at my time of entering the workplace some 40 odd years ago, some of that would have just slipped me by. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily have acknowledged all of what I've come to acknowledge. So there's a journey. And this is a nod to Jade's question, I think, but there's a maturity that one embraces as you grow older, and recognizing some of what's going on around you, and actually learning, sometimes through some very, very stiff and strong mistakes, but also through those experiences. Sometimes you can be hidden in plain sight. You walk into a room, you acknowledge that you're different in appearance to everyone else that's there, and you notice that things you're saying are not heard. You notice that things you've said are later on in the conversation attributed to someone else, particularly if they're a good idea. And you notice that there's a very strong narrative about individual taking over and leading what the discussion needs to be about, a very hierarchical grip around the conversations. And when you've been brought up in a culture that's at the opposite end of that spectrum, that's about how we operate, that Ubuntu, I see you, I am me because of you, we are interdependent. I grew up as a student of Martin Luther King Jr. and Martin Luther King Jr. spoke a lot about collectivism, a lot about people working together, and even across racial divides, he would talk about people working together. And in the workplace, certainly growing up in my early years, a lot of the emphasis was on assessing individuals on how they could account for what they had done, what they as individuals had achieved. And it always challenged me. I always felt, my first couple of interviews for what would have been promotion were almost destined to fail, but I didn't know that at the time, Dave. I went in looking to offer my best. But when I was asked the question, what have you achieved? I would talk about, well, what we did was, and when we had that problem, we came to, and I remember on one occasion that they stopped the interview and they said to me, Rob, you're not listening. We don't want to hear what you did together. We want to hear what you did. What did you do? And it's a very, dare I say it, it's a very Eurocentric approach. It's a very, I came, I saw, I conquered. And if not for, I did this. Well, I'm here to say, after 38 years in the public sector and just 2 years in the consultancy space, I achieved nothing without the people around me, without my friends, my family, the teams I'm a part of. And I look to make my contribution in the teams that I am a part of. And so I find it very difficult, Dave, to talk through the lens of I and what I did. I find it, to this day, I find it uncomfortable.
So can I just interject a follow-up there, Rob? So what about to the cynic who's like, okay, but how do I hold we accountable? Like, we're paying you a salary.
Sure.
And last I checked, we're not just paying we a salary. So what do you say to the accountability piece on that?
Well, I like to lead on, you know, you look at someone like Colin Powell, and he talks about his rules of leadership. He talks about sharing the credit. He talks about, absolutely, if you are assigned as the leader of a group of people, there is a point at which you need to represent that group. And I think with that representation and with that piece around leading that group, there is a premium that's paid in those hierarchical structures. But I have to tell you, Dave, I think some of that approach is flawed in so much as, who is it that leads a team, really? Who is it that gets the team across that finish line? Who is it that scores the winning goal, that achieves the ultimate aim? Is it always the captain? Is it always the manager? Who is it that we should be turning to at times of real challenge? You know, for me, some of the questions that emerge at these moments are rooted in what is sometimes flawed. And so we need to be careful about, you know, what our response to that might be. I fully accept, Dave, fully accept that in organizations, there are levels of responsibility that, if we look at tradition, will attract a premium, and people are paid to take on that headwind, and others aren't built for that. You know, Shahana's a leader. I'm a leader. You're a leader, Dave. Ritika's a leader. And there's a premium that attracts. But ultimately, when it comes to delivering on what needs to be delivered, I think it's important that as leaders, we acknowledge that that really is nearly always a team effort.
So good, Rob. And I'm mindful that even though this is an area I've researched, I've thought a lot about, even a lot of my mental frame with my 3 points I set up at the beginning, though I maybe didn't say this explicitly, but in my mind, I was thinking leader as in an individual, the Zelenskys, the Powells, etc. And you're giving this very collective, even definition of leader. Thank you to you both. So many fascinating things, and Ritika's going to start like scolding me for going too far off script. So this could be the part where I ask about your and Ritika's love for Caribbean food, but lest she get really upset with me. Ritika, let me ask you a different question. I'll keep Caribbean food out of it for right now. But you know, you have had a lot of global roles yourself in leadership positions across numerous different continents. If you had to reduce like the one key quality that a leader needs to have today to be effective, what would you say to that?
Thanks, Dave. Nothing on this call is scripted, is it? So, Caribbean food included. Yes, we did sort of discuss that that one leadership quality, and I've had a long, hard think about it. The first quality that came to my mind automatically and personally is authentic leadership. To me, that means everything. To show up as you are, warts and all. Bring your whole real self to work and lead by example. I think authentic leaders are ethical. They know how to use the right kind of power for the group good. This is where we're talking about the we, right? So that authentic leadership is it is individualistic in how you lead, but also collectivist in what you lead with. They use storytelling as a way of communicating and inspiring. They aren't afraid to show their vulnerability and admit their mistakes. To me, that means a lot. This is why I thought authenticity is really required from the leaders of today, a style that goes beyond the top-down approach where employees want to believe in the person in charge because they're committed to their work and believe in it. Barack Obama, Martin Luther King, Indra Nooyi, authentic leaders. To me, they're all authentic leaders. However, and yes, there is a however, I didn't want to just assume that my perception of leadership is everything. So yesterday, I opened this question up on LinkedIn and asked the question, what do individuals and leaders within my network is that one quality? Very interesting response. Honesty and integrity came right at the top, followed closely by empathy. So powerful. But empathy went to the next step, the importance of leaders to be compassionate. turns empathy into action. Courage is vital. A lot of people said leaders need to be able to take a stand on who they are, what they believe, being willing to stick their neck out. And I look at what's going on with the Ukrainian president. He is showing that courage on the hardest challenge that anyone would face in their career. The other thing that came out was listening. And we've talked about this. Shahana and Rob have already alluded to it, that listening to understand without judgment, with empathy, something magical can happen if leaders are willing to do that, and it comes naturally to them. So I've gone and listed all these traits, Dave, and all these characteristics, but without sounding cliche, I wish it wasn't coming from me, but it is I want to say I truly believe that a culturally intelligent leader is all of the above. A culturally intelligent leader has all these traits. Building the capability of CQ means an individual is curious. They want to listen to understand. They're compassionate, authentic, and courageous. Yeah. I'm not saying it. Research is saying it, and so is Deloitte. So in a nutshell, all of this to say, Dave, cultural intelligence is that must-have quality. And I promise this wasn't prepped to the audience.
Yes. So I don't think we have time to lean into it too far right now, but I think even your leading point there of authenticity is where that linked with CQ becomes so important. Because to come back to Jade's issue, I think we absolutely, as noted in Shahana and Rob's input, want to create organizational cultures where one doesn't need to cover being the kind of individual and leader they are. And yet, to use some of the examples you used as Ritika, if I say my natural self, my authentic self as a leader is to tell a lot of stories, but if you're leading me and stories just don't motivate me, then what does it mean for you? Rhetorical question, I'm not saying you have to answer this right now, but what does it mean for you to navigate your authentic leadership style is to lead with stories, but you're leading people who are like, give me data. I don't freaking care about your story right now. So I think that's where CQ comes in, saying we have to translate who we are authentically in a way that feels like we're still being true to ourselves, but we're always code switching based upon who it is we're trying to influence and lead appropriately.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Very good points, Dave. Very good points. Well made. I want to bring the floor back to Shahana and Rob. And we have alluded to this several times in the conversation, but very specifically, Shahana, how has cultural intelligence helped you to bring about the transformation?
Okay, can you see me or can you see me now? Because
yes,
I know my
we can
camera...
see you and hear you. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, so it's really interesting because we've had a tough 2 years in the NHS with dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And we've used it recently, very recently, in fact, it's happening right now, is we've used the cultural intelligence approach to support restoration and recovery. And just to give you a little bit of context, we had the vaccinations as a condition of employment, which was a proposal from the government about mandatory vaccinations for staff. Then it was withdrawn. And so we felt that we'd lost this trust and credibility of our staff. And I immediately thought about CQ because I thought what we need to have some restorative conversations with our staff where we can actually do it from a cultural values base, because what we were doing up to now wasn't going to have the impact we wanted to see. So we brought together a number of teams and we helped people to understand their CQ drive, their knowledge, their strategy and action. And then we helped them also to do their self-assessments around CQ. What we did as a result of that is start to create some conversation tools so that it changed the nature of conversation that you have with people, because you're doing it with an understanding of the approach that would work best. So if someone doesn't respond well to direct feedback or direct a conversation, the tool helps us to think about how can we understand the other person's way of communicating better, and how can we respond to that. So for us, it's been pretty transformational to help us support the restoration and recovery of our workforce.
Thank you, Shahana. Great use of the CQ tools to make that happen. And really back to you, Rob, on how have you brought about transformation using CQ?
Well, it's a great question, isn't it? And I know, since I bumped into cultural intelligence, or it bumped into me, I'm never without it. It's an insatiable journey, and so it's helped me in offering up routes to transformation in those that I work with by reminding me how important it is to check my fuel levels. To look at my energy. Whether it be the physical, the mental, intellectual, emotional, spiritual, but to pay attention to my well-being, and those that I am in relationship with, and those that are around me, those that are working alongside me, those that are signposting me to opportunities, is to really understand that there is more for me to absorb, more for me to participate in, and to really in the case of delivering on inclusion, which is part of my business, is to really get under the skin of bias. There's some fantastic questions in the chat. If empathy and authenticity are the favored qualities around leadership, then how do we explain the rise in power of people like Trump or Putin? Well, the simple answer is that electoral systems are not necessarily the mechanics by which we produce the best leaders. They're often first past the post. They're outdated, many of them. They're electoral college, or they're systems that are no longer reflective of what people are really holding as their views as citizens of any nation. So there's a lot of complex or more complex responses to that question, but that's the basic answer I would give. But so cultural intelligence helps me in so many ways that we, as Dave alluded to just now, we haven't got enough time to unpack all of it. But in terms of where I know, when I first graduated with the wonderful Jennifer Ezekiel at Above Difference, what was highlighted when we prayed together, that's what happened. Jennifer and I had a moment where we prayed together, and what emerged from that prayer was a real highlight of the need for me to get better at planning and building a strategy, a list of intent, a shopping list, if you will, about how I will deliver on cultural intelligence. My tank was full. My energy was overflowing. I scored high. My knowledge, residual knowledge, is quite good. I've got a good library around this stuff. I've got some good reference points, still lots to learn, but there's a healthy level of knowledge that I've got on board. But my planning, my strategy was poor. It's getting better. And so when it comes to me having the impact I want to have, when it comes about converting that plan into real outward signs, some real moments of truth, I call them, but actually delivering on what it is my heart intends, that's where I think I've made the biggest step forward. I'm still excited about what lies ahead. I'm still excited about winning more people to cultural intelligence, because after 24 years facilitating and delivering training courses, I know, it's not a belief, I know that the secret sauce is cultural intelligence. The bit that brings all of that stuff together is cultural intelligence, understanding what others are going through and really exercising those muscles to be empathic in all our communications. That's what's so important.
Thank you, Rob. And the more I listen to this, I'm just thinking to everyone that's listening, you have a panel of people that have brought about transformational change using CQ. This is real. As Rob is saying, he knows, he doesn't feel. And this is why it's increasingly in the leadership space, cultural intelligence is the key leadership skill that is required for the leader going forward. So thank you for that. And funny enough, Rob, my strategy came out low as well. Here's me thinking I've traveled the world and whatnot. And so you and I need some tips from you on that, since you've already done the hard work from the sounds of it. Dave, back on stage. From what you have observed in culturally intelligent leaders around the world, what's one observation that you can share with us today?
Yeah, thanks. There's so many, but the first thing that comes to mind, especially in light of the conversation from the last 40 minutes, is that oftentimes I will hear individuals who have a lot of experience working with people from diverse backgrounds or internationally who say, isn't a culturally intelligent leader basically someone who's respectful no matter what? Or aren't they somebody who demonstrates empathy or compassion, or somebody who knows how to build trust? And I actually think, like, hey, what a great foundation on which to develop culturally intelligent leadership that develops transformation, respect, and trust. But Ritika, and you and I have had this conversation in the past as well, that the question is, what makes me feel respected as compared to what makes Rob feel respected? And so we're back to Maya Angelou's quote. Like, I've probably spent far too much time over the last several years talking about positive intent, don't assume ill. And I still think in the drive piece, that's a good starting point. Let me not just immediately assume ill. But ultimately, I don't give a rip what your intent was. All I know is I felt very disrespected, or I felt very respected. So I would say that the culturally intelligent leaders that I've had the privilege of interacting with around the world, including the three of you on this panel, are individuals that know different behaviors communicate respect or communicate empathy according to people in different cultures. So there needs to be that zone of flexibility for how we go about making you feel respected, or making you feel like I'm trustworthy, etc.
No, really good point, Dave. Really good point, because that definitely has been in my short journey on CQ. It really has been learning lessons where, because of my cultural background and the way I perceive hierarchy, it's not necessary that that respect to me is respect to the other individual, or kindness, or in fact, even, the way we give, the way we ask people to do things for us within our team. So great point. Thanks, Dave. We are now open to the floor for questions. And I think the one that really needs going back to is Jade's, a little bit more detail. And the floor is Shahana, Rob, Dave, all of you open for that. Is a question from Dave around code switching, really, that covering. So I'm happy to read the question out for the audience. Is CQ the capability to adapt in cross-cultural situation? Would that conflict with covering in unconscious bias? What if adapting to the culture requires to cover? How would a leader balance that? I think there's a great need to address that a little more, because if you show up as authentic leaders, again, that whole conversation around how do you ensure that you aren't just covering?
Yeah, so I'll give you a little heads up, Shahana. I'd be interested to hear you speak about this, coming off of what you said earlier about, being told to do the firm handshake and to speak up, and that being counterintuitive. And while you're, as one who's maybe not as extroverted as Rob, and who maybe scored higher on CQ strategy the first time you took the assessment than some extroverts might, I'll give you just a moment to think about that and say, I think it's important for someone like me to acknowledge too that I'm asked to cover much less than the three of you are. So that it's not an equal ask here, because the world is made for leaders like me, who operate like me, who naturally do the firm handshake, who naturally, use charisma to inspire in that. And so I think there's it's easy for me to say, well, we all have to adapt who we are. Like, there's times I have to cover because I can't act, but I have to do it, I would guess, a lot less than the three of you do. So with that lead in, Shahana, how would you speak to that? Like, how do you find that balance of, I'm not going to be respected if I don't adapt, but now I've lost myself?
Exactly. Yeah, and you've demonstrated some of that by just giving me that thinking time already. So thank you for that. Yes, I think it's the context in which we need to switch codes. So there's a really interesting piece by, I don't know if you know, Professor David Williams from Harvard University, who writes about the impact of weathering, the impact of day-to-day racism that we're dealing with, that actually can take years of our lives. And the group that's most impacted by weathering is the high coping group, which is people who are actually doing well in their careers and surviving. And the reason I wanted to give that context is because it depends on the reason that you're code switching. Because you can do it from a position of power. So I switch code. I do this all the time when I'm speaking to different sets of stakeholders, or traveling from home to work. I do switch all the time, but there's an element of choice. And code switching under duress or with negativity because you don't feel the way that you operate is good enough, that can be quite damaging. So I would just go back to say that it's down to the context of where and when you do it, and the balance of power.
Very helpful. Thank you for that.
Rob, did you want to pitch in on that?
Yeah, well, firstly, thanks for that, Shahana, and thanks for bringing to the fore the work of Dr. David Williams. I've just popped a link into one of his TED Talks on the chat there that some of our listeners might want to dive into if they haven't already. And, you know, as was shared by Ritika in the introductions, I enjoyed a 38-year career in the civil service, the UK civil service. And I have to tell you, for the final 28 years of that career, I was a black man. And in case you're wondering, before that, and for my first decade, I was colorless. I wasn't black, I wasn't white. I was merely going about my everyday work and effort and job to be the best that I could be, to make my mum proud, to share my achievements with my dad. They operated on slightly different pinch points for me, but certainly I wasn't conscious of being any different in terms of my ethnicity or my race. It wasn't on my radar. But about a decade into my journey, literally about 10 years in, I noticed something quite peculiar. It felt peculiar at the time, that people I had coached, mentored, people that I had helped and prepared them for interviews, on a couple of occasions, interviews that I was going for as well, by the way, they were landing jobs. They were getting the jobs that they were going for, you know, almost saying goodbye to me on the way through. They were moving on. Some of them coming back to me to say, Rob, I'm finding it really difficult. Can you just remind me, how do I go about this part? And I was sitting there thinking, hang on a minute. All these people are coming past me in this kind of faster stream, and I'm in this slow space. What's wrong? What's wrong with me? Do I give off some kind of poor aroma or something? And the penny dropped. There was another set of rules that I wasn't aware of. There was another narrative going on that I hadn't had access to. That I had the parents I had, and I'd come from a single parent family background. But in those conversations where you get to that next point in that kind of labyrinth of elevation in any organization, I ran out of chips at the table. I wasn't the person that was able to see the hand that my opponent was holding. I couldn't call my full potential into play. And it dawned on me slowly. You talk about weathering, Shahana. It dawned on me slowly but surely there was something else going on. There was another set of rules that I needed to learn. And so I set about learning them. And that's where my thought about getting under the skin of bias comes from. It's a deliberate double entendre, because it is about going deeper. It is about understanding, well, what are the rules of this game? Now, in answer to the question about code switching, I remember I passed one interview pretending to be something I wasn't. I didn't feel good about it, but I wanted to give them what I thought they wanted to hear, because I wanted to regulate my accent and not flatten my THs and pretend I listen to Radio 2 if you're in this country, the UK, and take up golf. You know, there were things that allowed you to move on to that next stage of conversation that were unwritten, but they were there. They were absolutely there, and they're powerful. They're powerful. How do you participate in those? I see you, David. I see you wanting to come in on me, but just to hold that out there for a moment and say that these rules are pushed in on some folks, and we have little or no say about it. And then decisions are made about whether you are a safe pair of hands or whether you are the right person for the job based on your ability to tick some of those boxes.
Yeah, and I wasn't trying to cut you off. I was enthused by what you were saying, and this is really dangerous to say on a webinar where we don't have a chance to really interact about it. And given my own cultural background, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, but to speak for myself, it feels like we could be doing a disservice if we only say to people of color, quit covering, just be yourself, etc., because that's not the narrative in the world in which they exist. And so, Dara was talking about the power of having advocates and allies and coaches that advocate on their behalf. And so I want to create a world that doesn't require the three of you to cover, but I also want to, at least to use Shahana's term, give you the agency and choice to say, okay, you might not be stepping into the most culturally intelligent group right now, so play them a little bit, play their game and talk the way they want you to talk. And so at least then you're making a conscious, anyway, I'm white-splaining what you just said, but it just struck a chord with me.
Possibly, but I feel you, Dave, and I understand what you're saying, and it might come across that way to some folks. But what I will reply to you and say is that the added feature of that, for many people who are othered, for many people who are pushed onto the periphery, who are placed on the periphery, is not simply the microaggressions that they face, but when they respond to those microaggressions and come back stronger, it's the gaslighting that then takes place that really draws the energy out of you, leaves you knackered. You're absolutely, you're so tired that you don't know what to do with yourself next. And it's that fatigue, when you're brave enough, post George Floyd, bless his soul, but when you're brave enough to recall the knee on your neck, when you're brave enough to recall the racism that you faced, to then be told that, are you sure that's what happened? Are you sure it's down to you? As we were told a year ago today in a government commissioned report called the Commission on Racial and Ethnic Disparities, when that report then wants to say after 9 months and 248 pages that institutional racism is no longer a thing, we're in a bad place, because that is a letdown. That was an opportunity to shine a light on what many of us face. And going back to what Ritika was saying, I believe that part of our best response to the challenges we face, the turbulence we face, the microaggressions and the gaslighting, is to become more culturally intelligent. That's our best response.
Fabulous, Rob. And as Amy puts it in the chat, performative, it's draining. We know how that feels to just not be who you are, and how wonderful it feels to actually really show up as your real self with everything else, and how you can actually concentrate on doing your job really, rather than everything else that comes in the way. From Shahana's talk, there's a question from Mark. Wouldn't collectivism be a strength for a leader to build a team and get more people involved? Seems more in line with servant leadership versus what some still hold on to as a leader that there is to save them.
Do you want me to pick that up, Ritika?
Sure, if that's okay.
Yeah. Yes, I would say I think the world is catching up with us now, because there's more acknowledgement that the servant leadership is a powerful way of leading, and compassionate and inclusive leadership is what we need to see. But I think that we've been on a leadership journey, haven't we, where the dominant style, if you're in a culture where the dominant style is to be more authoritative and more assertive, then that sort of that humility, that servant leadership isn't always acknowledged and welcomed. What I'm finding now in the NHS, because of we have something called the NHS People Plan, there's a real push to see more compassionate and culturally intelligent leaders who can take in and maximize the skills of their whole team. And that's what a high performing team is. And we've seen on the call today how, even though Rob and I have completely different backgrounds and styles, and yet we've had that same consistent journey of feeling othered or feeling bypassed for promotion. We haven't got chips on our shoulders. We're just pointing out the reality that if you're not part of the majority, you're sorry, somebody said they can't see me on screen, so sorry about that. But oh yes, I haven't been put onto the main screen, Ritika. But anyway, if you're not part of the majority, then you can see that you will be othered, and you'll get that feeling that you're not good enough. Sorry, carry on.
Thank you, Shahana. That's yeah. I think the screen is frozen, but we can hear you loud and clear.
You can see me. Like, you can hear me, but you can't see me. Okay, right, thank you.
Thank you for that. Dave, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
I think it's very well said. And the only piece that I would supplement is something many of you heard me say before is, kind of an informal review of a lot of leadership literature found that 90% of leadership materials are oriented toward an individualist, low power distance culture, and yet 70% of the world is collectivist and high power distance. So to the very point that Shahana is making, I mean, Shahana's preferences are the majority, unfortunately not the dominant majority yet, but I'm encouraged to hear you perceive that the world is catching up.
Thank you, Dave. Am I putting you in the spot here by asking you about the link between CQ and LMX leadership theory? That's the question that's come in.
Sure. No, I'll just be very brief on it for those who are not as familiar with leader-member exchange theory. I think there are some interesting links. I don't know of any that have specifically explored it from a research perspective, but others of you may have a much richer understanding of LMX theory. But it's talking about the very fact that a leader will often develop different levels of respect and interpersonal connection with some followers more than others. And I think where CQ would come in again, much like what Rob was saying a little bit ago, is looking at, is that affinity bias? Is that why there's a deep leadership member exchange there? Or is there some other variable that's going on? So I don't know of any research that's explored the connections, but I certainly see why our guest would see some overlap between the two, because I think there's much to be explored there.
Thank you, Dave. I think we're running out of time. If there's any final thoughts from the three of you, otherwise I'm going to try and look to close. There's a great conversation going on in the chat there. So if there's anything from Dave, Rob, Shahana as last leaving thoughts on this topic.
I do just want to echo what Shahana was saying about the world catching up, Ritika. I think that one of the things that cultural intelligence does, and does very well, is that it gives permission to turn up the volume and to shine a brighter light on difference. And in doing so, it also, in a very practicable way, it shifts the onus on the majority culture to say, there's more for us to learn. There's more for us to know and understand, even about ourselves. That because we may be majority, because we may be default, it doesn't mean that we're right about everything. It doesn't mean that the way we're doing it is the way it needs to be done. And I think what cultural intelligence does, in a beautiful way, in a beautiful way, is it says, let's all dance. Let's turn up the volume on difference. Let's get rid of periphery, and let's say, you know what, time for a brighter space that gives more room, a bigger playground to people who are not part of a majority culture. And I think that's why I'm in love with cultural intelligence.
Thank you, Rob. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. In 1 minute to go, I'm just going to really say a heartfelt thank for the wonderful insights. Everyone thinks it should have been a 1.5 hour webinar. I think it should have been 3 hours. I thoroughly enjoyed listening and learning from you, Dave, Shahana, and Rob, and I'm sure the audience did as well. Thank you, everyone, from the bottom of our hearts for your time and for being here today. For those in the UK, you can meet this illustrious panel in person in London on the 14th or the 15th or both of March. It's all on our website as public events, and they are delivering keynotes and masterclasses on various topics, including CQ and healthcare. We would love to see you there. So thanks again, everyone, and bye for now.
Thank you. And thank you for these wonderful comments, everybody. I want to get a printout from my mum. Good stuff. Thank you. Stay well, folks. Stay well.